My name is Emma Rathie. I'm the manager of programs and exhibition production here at the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, New York. And welcome to today's Virtual in Focus lecture. If you haven't been to a virtual in Focus lecture or in person, these are kind of lifting the veil as to what's happening behind the scenes at the museum. It sheds a little bit of light onto all the different projects that we do here, rather than just exhibitions. So I hope today's talk is insightful and does lift that veil for you to film preservation services. This afternoon, Chris Kraus, Graham Brown, and Joshua Yoakum, all members of the film preservation team, are going to discuss the processes and challenges for film preservation in the digital age. This presentation will provide an in-depth exploration of how archival and often unprojectable films from the George Eastman Museum are digitized and restored in the Film Preservation Services Digital Lab. At the Digital Laboratory at Eastman Business Park in Rochester, George Eastman Museum Film Preservation Services provides high-quality digital services to cultural institutions and commercial enterprises. As one of the world's leading film archives, we take pride in our exacting standards, and we approach every project with the same care and expertise that we apply to our own film preservation practices. So I'm very excited for you all to hear what the team has to say this afternoon. I'm sorry about my phone. If you have questions today during the presentation, please use the Q&A button on your screen. This is going to be at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on what device you're logging in with today. And at the end of the talk, we'll get through as many of the questions as we're able to. The chat function is also open, as you might have seen when you logged in, but please don't put questions there as we're not monitoring the chat this afternoon. We are also recording today's talk, so we will put this on our YouTube channel in the future. And if you would like to rewatch the lecture or share it with friends, you'll be able to do so. You can also find other virtual programs and public programs on our YouTube channel. But without taking any more time, I'm going to pass it over to the Film Preservation Services team to take over.
Thank you very much, Emma, for that introduction. I'm Graham Brown. I'm here with Josh Yoakum and Chris Kraus, my colleagues at Film Preservation Services at the George Eastman Museum. And we are a full digital preservation lab. And so we're going to talk today about what that means and the different operations and procedures that happen behind the scenes when film from the collection is selected for preservation. So we'll start off just with the question, what is preservation? So for motion pictures, preservation essentially is duplication. All historic film stock deteriorates and decomposes over time. Nitrate film, which was by far the most common type of film used in motion picture production before 1951, decomposes in a manner shown here by the image on the right side of your screen. The emulsion will bubble and break down as the image quite literally melts away off the film. This chemical process is irreversible and is accelerated by poor storage conditions. So to preserve these films, we have to duplicate them and get a snapshot of the images before they disappear for good. And when we duplicate a film, the process can be done photochemically or digitally. At the museum, we consider a film to be preserved when we've obtained a new duplicate negative of the film. Why is that? Because a new negative gives us a fresh starting point for generating new copies and creating new prints. And additionally, a negative on modern film stock, if stored properly, will remain stable for dozens, if not hundreds of years. Negatives can be made through contact or optical printing, or by taking a digital master file and recording it back out onto film. And these two options represent the photochemical and digital methods of duplication. An important thing to note here is that these procedures aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. A film is not precluded from having digital work performed if it's been photochemically preserved in the past, and vice versa. At FPS, Film Preservation Services, our primary task is to create these digital masters of the at-risk and significant films in the Eastman Museum's collection. When we duplicate a film, our focus is on creating an authentic digital representation of the original object. So now I'll hand the mic over to Josh Yoakum, who will speak more on the ethics and procedures of maintaining authenticity in the digital space.
Hello, everyone. So this idea of authentically representing the original film brings us to ethics. This is not a film. This is a Spanish fresco painted in 1930. Some of you may be familiar with it after the work was restored in 2012. So this example, even though it's not a film, kind of gets at what we mean when we talk about authentically representing the original. This is an example of what we're trying to avoid. When we digitize and start restoring a film, we have the potential to drastically change how it looked. There are tools for things like upscaling images, removing grain, changing the frame rate of a film, or colorizing black and white footage. And these are all types of interventions that would potentially not preserve the authenticity of the original. Our goal isn't to try to improve or change the original. It's to reduce the damage that has accumulated over time and avoid introducing new errors or artifacts, and to accurately represent what the film originally looked like. And that also includes maybe preserving characteristics that may be inherent limitations of the technology that was used to create the original. Next slide, please, Graham. So when we preserve something, it's not quite as simple as just making a direct copy and then we're done. Subjective choices are made, which makes it necessary to ask ethical questions during the process. When a film is being restored, how far can we go without betraying the original work? Our decisions need to agree on an ethical code for restoration, and for that we look to organizations like FIAF, the International Federation of Film Archives, and AMIA, the Association of Moving Image Archives. Drawing from those sources, our decisions in the preservation process need to be reversible. They need to prevent further deterioration or alteration of the original artifact, and they need to be carefully documented. So next slide.
So I'll pick up here. We have a handful of devices that we use to digitize the material at the lab, but what we consider our preservation level film scanner is an ARRIScan XT. It's capable of handling 35mm and 16mm film. We write every frame of any film that we're dealing with receives an individual file, and those are written in uncompressed DPX files. That's sort of a type of image raster file. And we're capturing 3 separate color exposures, red, green, and blue, for every single frame. And those are narrowband LEDs. The whole machine was designed to work primarily with color negative, later color negative from the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, but is able to handle film positives very well. We're able to scan in up to 6K resolution. Usually, though, we scan in a 4K, it's called overscan. So we see some of the perforations on the edge of the film. I think we'll see examples of that later. And our current specifications for capture are, it's a 10-bit logarithmic encoding for negatives, and for positives, we use a 16-bit linear or normalized, so-called normalized encoding. And we can talk about that later. But it's important to note, again, that for every single frame, we're generating a considerably large individual file. So at the museum, we store our nitrate film rolls typically on 1,000 feet, or in 1,000 feet cans, and there could be up to well, for 35mm, there's 16 frames per foot, so that could be up to 16,000 frames and thus 16,000 files. for just one reel. So it adds up quickly. I think we can go to the next slide, please, Graham. So here's an example of just how challenging our some of the projects that we work on can be. This is a film, The Red Peacock, from 1920, that was discovered in a New York City basement, I believe in 2020, and was donated to the museum, where it was one of the only copies known to exist. The other copy is a very short fragment that exists in at the Film Museum in Amsterdam. And so this was a fuller picture of the reel, but unfortunately it is suffering from severe nitrate decomposition, hydrolysis, and plenty of other methods of decomposition, I'm sure. But go ahead and play the clip, Graham, and we'll see if the audience can find where the decomp begins. Pretty quick. But we were luckily able to scan this. Not the entirety of it. A lot of sections of it had actually fused together and started to crumble. The end stages of nitrate decomposition are very unfortunate, and essentially the film will crystallize and turn into a brown powder not long after the stage that you're looking at now. But luckily the base was still strong enough for us to scan through the AreaScan XT. We have sprocketed and sprocketless drives. So the sprocketless drives were critical in transporting this specific element through the machine, and that can handle very high shrinkages because again, an organic film base support shrinks over time. So yeah, I think we can move on as well. So another aspect of our roles and projects that we've been sort of embarking on recently are what are called reconstructions. And many of you may be familiar with this term, but for us it means taking multiple unique elements of a given title, and where certain ones may have frames missing throughout them individually, if combined together, we can potentially reconstitute the original runtime, which we can learn from existing documentation. So this image on the bottom of your screen is a look at a digital editing software timeline where we've taken, let's see, 4 different elements of the same film, and through sort of editing, we rank what would be what we consider the superior element of the 4, either from its optical quality or its length, or some factor that we determine to be sort of the most ideal, or the closest to the original element would be something else to consider. But we then try and again reconstitute the original runtime to the best of our ability. So through that process, we are reaching out to our film archive partners to see what elements they hold. We're searching in our collection, and we'll do a comparison of what's available, select the ones that we think are the highest quality or the most complete. We'll digitize all of them, synchronize them, and then through this, after this step, we'll go to digital restoration. But before that, we can document all of the frames that were used. It gives us a very exact frame count for all of the elements that are involved, and we can document how close we get to that original runtime. If original documentation can show, it was this many feet, we can see just how close we get, and often we're able to get very close to that original length. So here's an example of this is an ungraded and unsized, I believe, maybe slightly sized, which not even near restored version of a film we're working on by William S. Hart, an early cowboy film star. And this will show you, Graham, feel free to play the clip. It will show you we've roughly aligned, we've scanned all of these elements. This may be 3 or 4 or 5, but you're seeing very, very rapidly they're switching switching between elements, and we've done our best to synchronize them to be, continuous and all be on the same frame, but you'll see there are certain dropouts between elements. So in order to reach that original runtime, we're cutting between elements here. Afterwards, we will restore them and we'll grade them with a master element. Ideally, that's an original release print that we will then sort of conform the look of the others as close as possible to sort of seamlessly integrate them all to one another. But this gives you sort of a quick look at, once they're all in a timeline and roughly sized, sort of the starting point for our restoration step, which comes next. Yeehaw.
Thank you, Chris. Typically, after a film has been scanned and reconstructed, if necessary, we'll digitally restore the film. And in restoration, the primary functions are additional stabilization, deflickering, and the reduction of dirt, dust, and scratches. Our goal with restoration is to repair the damage that is accumulated on the object over time. We are not trying to upscale the image here, which goes in line with our philosophy of creating authentic digital representations. So as Josh said, we don't colorize films that were shot in black and white. We don't increase the frame rate to smooth motion. We're not degraining and or regraining the image, nor do we artificially sharpen it. We want our digital masters to reflect the year when the object was made and not the year when the object was restored. In our minds, perfect restoration is an invisible one with no trace of the restorer's hand. And restoration can almost be interpreted as a sort of Photoshop for movies. Our restoration programs will compare each frame to its neighboring frames and flag any areas of drastic difference as a defect. So on the image on screen, all of the perceived defects are flagged in red, which illustrates how difficult it can be to notice the extent of dirt or dust present on a film with just your eyes alone. When part of the image is identified as dust, it is covered up by a kind of patch of visual information that is interpolated or sometimes duplicated from the adjacent frames. And an important step in this process is to verify the computer's work. There are automatic filters that will scan each shot for dust, but it's not uncommon for these programs to generate what we call false positives and interpret part of the natural image as areas of dust. And frequent offenders of false positives will include people's eyes or buttons on their clothing. Patterned dresses often get flagged as dust that's moving around on a character, and flies that might be buzzing around the image. And the two programs that we currently use for restoration are Diamant and Phoenix, which are currently the two global leaders in film restoration software. So here's an example of a before and after restoration of a film called The Clutch of Circumstance. This is a formerly lost film that was identified in the museum's collections that was restored earlier this year. So on the bottom right of the image, you see the unrestored version, which is shakier, has more flicker. You'll see it gets brighter and darker. It's got more scratches, more dust. And then on the upper left is after restoration, where it's steady and clear and relatively dust-free. After restoration comes grading. Grading is the process where we manipulate the image to give it a certain look for exhibition. At Film Preservation Services, we grade our film in a theatrical screening room, as it is important to grade the film in an environment that mimics the environment where it will ultimately be screened. If we have one available, as Chris mentioned, we'll use an original projection print of a film as a grading reference, which gives us a visual target that we attempt to match digitally. When working on a reconstruction using multiple film sources, a large part of the process is, as Chris mentioned, grading those multiple film elements to match each other as closely as possible. The video you saw earlier, Truthful Tulliver, the cowboy film, demonstrated the range of difference that can be found across film elements of different stocks, gauges, or generations just for the same title. Additionally, we'll typically recreate tints that were applied to films during the grading process. A lot of people think of film that all films in the silent era were all black and white, when in reality, many of these films used historic color processes such as tinting and toning to add color. Over time, the dyes in these tints may have faded, or the duplicate negatives that were made were struck in black and white. So when we can, we recreate the tint based on information that we do have available to us. And one of the challenges with grading these historic film materials is that we have little to no information on the film stock's characteristic curves, which would express the film stock's density range as a function of exposure. Modern film negatives have known characteristic curves, which allow for clearly defined lookup tables that can be applied during the grading procedures that easily translate the visual information into a specific color space. We have no such information or transforms for a lot of our historic films or historic film colors, which makes it more difficult to produce the most authentic image possible. So here's an example of some grading work using recent preservation projects, the film Man, Woman, and Sin. So what you see right now is the ungraded, unrestored files. So it's black and white. It was made using projection print from the mid 20th century. And now, after restoration and grading, we've reapplied the tint and cleaned up the dust, given it a slightly higher contrast. And now it looks more close to what an original exhibition print of this film would have looked like in 1927. So now I'll hand it over back to Josh, who will talk about what we do with our files after all of these steps of the workflow.
So archiving and access. When we finish a project, we end up with a few different elements. Typically, we'll produce physical film elements. As mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, we consider a film preserved when we have a new duplicate negative. So for a digital project, this will mean a laser recorded negative and things like new exhibition prints for theatrically projecting the film. This part is relatively straightforward because all of these film materials can be stored in our temperature and humidity controlled vaults with all of our other film material. And then in addition to that, we'll also end up with a variety of digital material or digital elements as well. For distribution, we'll make a DCP that's going to be like the digital version of our exhibition prints. And we'll also end up with all of the elements that were created along the way to create that DCP. So that'll include things like raw scans, restored or graded versions of the raw files, project files, and smaller files for access and use. Reversibility and documentation are important for us, so we want to keep all of these files from every step along the way in case we ever need to return to a project later on. Prior to backing them up, image sequences are losslessly compressed to FFV1 MKV files using an open source program called Raw Cooked that can consolidate those large image sequences into easier to manage files. And then all of those digital files get backed up to duplicate LTO9 tapes, with each copy being stored in a separate geographic location. Currently, the moving image department has over 1 petabyte or 1,000 terabytes of data stored on LTO tapes, and that number only continues to increase each month. Next slide, please. So wrapping things up, what are some of the overall challenges that we face? The files themselves that we work with are hard to deal with. They're large, both in terms of the amount of space that they take up and in terms of the number of files that we produce. We can see the image on the side of this slide. It's one reel of film. It is almost 2 terabytes and contains over 13,000 files. Throughout the whole process of restoring and grading this film, we might end up with 2 or 3 copies of each reel that are each going to have different changes made to them. So by the end of the project, we'll be storing multiple copies of this one reel. And to handle high resolution, high bit depths, we also need powerful hardware. So when dealing with files that are 4K or 6K, even seemingly simple things like just reading the data fast enough to play it back smoothly can actually be a challenge. And then the idea of mass digitizing everything is appealing, but when we're dealing with files of this size and quantity, the data burden and cost would be an extreme challenge. And that's not even considering how hard it would be to prep and scan everything if we wanted to mass digitize. Again, we already have over a petabyte of data that needs to be managed, and at this point, we've only scanned a very small fraction of what the museum holds. The non-standard nature of the film that we work with is also another challenge, as Graham talked about earlier. Unlike modern film stocks, where the look and characteristics of those films are documented enough that you can have pre-existing transforms for easily adjusting their look digitally, most of the films that we work with predate that kind of standardization. And as a result, we often need to come up with creative ways of adapting modern technology and workflows to suit the needs of our materials. And we're also always exploring new ways to improve how we can produce the most authentic results possible. And lastly, there's also the question of the future of film. So we're committed to preserving our films on film and now and for the foreseeable future. But the landscape and long-term future of film and film labs is different now than it was 20 years ago, and it can always change. At the same time, our LTO digital storage is only projected to have a lifespan of up to 30 years, and with the hardware and software dependencies, that realistically is probably actually a little lower than that. So a film on a shelf in a temperature and humidity controlled vault is still actually the most stable long-term format that we have at the end of a project. And next slide, please. So that's it. The end. If you have any questions, feel free to add them.
Thank you guys so much. That was really interesting to listen about the whole process from front to back. There are a bunch of questions in the Q&A. So one that I would love to start with, somebody asked, I would like to do your kind of job, and I'd like to know what steps do you recommend I take to get into restoration?
The museum actually has a graduate program in film archiving. It is the L. Jeffrey Selznick School of Film Preservation, and they have a 1-year certificate or 2 years master's programs available. All 3 of us are actually graduates of that program, and there you will learn all the steps of film archiving, both the physical collection management side of things, cataloging, as well as the digital workflows, such as film restoration.
There are other. Sorry, go ahead, John.
I was just going to say, I mean, a lot of the skills that you'd get using a program like Photoshop also translate. So if you want kind of something, an action item that you can kind of move on immediately, learning a program like Photoshop or other tools that kind of use similar, that have similar ideas can all translate, also using video editing software.
And the Association of Moving Image Archivists has a listserv where a lot of people in the field discuss any issue that's come up. That could be a good place to start to post some questions maybe, or yeah, look at the correspondence there.
All great insight. Our next question says, how do you determine which color tints to use for films that are only available in black and white?
That is a very good question. We have a large collection of paper documents as well in the moving image department. Our stills, posters, and paper collection will have documents such as continuities, which are similar to shooting scripts, which will have information on tints. And for projects such as Man, Woman, and Sin, where we didn't have any original elements that had the tint, we had documents that illustrated which shots were tinted, which colors, and we are able to identify other films in our collection that were made by the same studio in the same year that were using the same tints, and being able to cross-reference things that were produced around the same time helps us identify the correct colors.
Thank you, Graham. Our next question asks, what films are you currently restoring?
Many. I think we've been working on 9 William S. Hart films, similarly complicated reconstructions as the one that you saw. What else are we working on, guys?
We are working on a silent Russian film. We are working on an X-ray film currently, which fits in line with spooky season, which has been a real treat to work on something as unique as that. We're also, oh, Josh, we just finished something else. What was it? The Czech film?
Country Beyond.
Yep, that one. So we have a lot of active projects, usually all happening at different steps along the process at any given moment. So there's actually we have quite a long laundry list of films that we're actively working on, but the Hart films are our main sort of overarching multi-year objective right now.
Great. Thanks for answering that. Another common question I feel like that I would have myself is, what programs and funding or sponsors are the digitizations and restorations financed through?
That's a great question. Many of them are funded through the National Film Preservation Foundation, NFPF. We also have funding from the Louis B. Mayer Foundation. In the past, we received funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities or the National Endowment for the Arts. Other private donors certainly fund our preservation. Those are probably the main players, though.
Great. Okay, this is less a question, more of a comment, but someone mentioned, in terms of authenticity, we now often see prints or prints in parentheses or digital directly from a negative, whereas in the 1930s would have been internegative, interpositives, etc. So now we see wires on the flying monkeys in The Wizard of Oz, which viewers wouldn't have seen in the theaters in 1939. With a PS note that yes, Wizard of Oz would have had 3 negatives for Technicolor, but question would apply also to black and white like Key Largo. Any comments there?
Yeah, that's something to consider. I mean, many of the preservation elements that we deal with are negatives of from a positive. So we're getting a generation away from that. But in cases where we have say the original camera negative, it's something to think about. Usually there are, when scanning a negative, we will capture its sort of maximum resolution, and But it's definitely something to think about. What level of detail or quality an audience would have seen. I would say in that case, the best representation then would actually potentially be if we were to create a film out negative and then strike a print, you would have that at least one generation, sort of one generational step down, which is I think that's our preferred method of exhibition.
And to jump off of that, it highlights how important it is when you're undertaking a large preservation to do the call for elements that we mentioned to our archival partners, because if we say only have that original negative with the wires and you can see things that normally wouldn't have been seen, it's quite possible that another archive does have an internegative that we could scan that might be that might create a more authentic viewing experience for the audience at the end. So it's important to get a sense of what is available when you're starting these projects so that you don't find yourself with your hands tied later down the road.
It is maybe also worth noting that on a number of projects, we've done kind of like scans of multiple elements and compared the results. So that's also something that we'll occasionally do.
Next question is, why 10-bit log for negs and not 16-bit linear like positives?
There's always that option to scan everything 16-bit linear, but interestingly, the formats that were established very early on for digital negatives through Kodak and other players, the Cineon file was established in 10-bit because logarithmic or negatives, the logarithmic standard was based on the way that film negatives store information and like the way that they hold density, and that's not a linear relationship. So a lot of the important areas of density get transferred into the important bits in a digital in the digital equivalent. So we don't need as many bits to represent the dynamic range, which is already lesser in negatives. So I hope that makes sense. But we could scan 16-bit linear. We would just then put a we would probably use a transform to get it into that logarithmic space afterwards.
Thanks, Chris. Next question is, can you create physical film outs? And I'm adding a second part to that question for people like me who don't know what a film out or what that means. So if you could explain that as well.
A film out is when we send our digital masters to be recorded back out onto a modern negative. That's using a device called a film recorder, which uses lasers to print the image information onto a new negative. And that's done in a photochemical lab. We do not have an operational film recorder on site, so those projects get sent out to various labs for generating new negatives. But so that when we say film out, we mean going from the digital space back into physical film negative. And that's done at a number of different film labs, either here in the United States or globally.
Thank you. Very insightful for me specifically. Okay, next question. Are any of your restorations available on DVD or Blu-ray?
I think many of them, yeah. It depends. I think I can think of a recent example of The Unknown. We completed a couple years ago, and that was distributed through the Criterion Collection. I know that's available. Many are digital and film releases currently, but there are a number actually through, say, Kino Lorber or other sort of home distribution labels that films will make it to disc.
We also we have another one coming out soon. I don't know if we're allowed to share the title, but we did finish a restoration this year that should be getting a Blu-ray release very in the near future.
Okay, next question. Do you also use raw cooked during the digitization process to save the space of the local storage?
So we do frequently raw cook stuff kind of as early in the process as possible, and then back that up to LTO tapes so that the kind of copy on our local servers isn't the only copy of scan that we have. But the one thing to keep in mind with our raw cooked files is that they aren't as compatible with our restoration software or color grading software. So even though we may raw cook a file, that file is often, once it's raw cooked, now not usable in our actual like working software. So usually we'll raw cook something, back up the raw cooked file, and then continue to work on the DPX files. And then kind of once the project is finished, we'll raw cook the rest of those final files and then back those up as well.
Thanks, Josh. Just a couple more questions here, but if you're still thinking and brainstorming, please submit those through the Q&A function. One question says, how do you prioritize and choose which works to restore?
That's a very good question. An important thing to note is that the three of us are not the ones making those decisions. It's a curatorial level choice, but there are multiple characteristics a film can have that will affect how high up it is on our preservation priorities. So things that are significant, either historically or culturally, or unique, or at risk, will be typically the highest priority. So significant can be any major film release, or it contains information that's culturally significant for a certain country or for a certain time period. If an item is unique, if it has some characteristic that is not shared by other copies of the same film, so that could mean it's the only surviving copy, or it could mean it's the only surviving uncensored copy of a certain film. And also, if a film is starting to deteriorate, like you saw earlier with the Red Peacock, that will make it a priority, because because again, that process is irreversible. So we want to duplicate that as quickly as we can.
Great answer. Any advice for someone looking to preserve a small collection of Kodachrome home movies from the 1950s? Should I look to get a positive duplication or a negative?
Well, the Kodachromes are probably they'll be positives. So if you can get film copies made of them, I think that would be a very wise thing to do. The negatives won't be as readily viewable as the positive Kodachromes they have, but you can then strike prints from them, and I think a lab, once you already have a negative, I think it's not as expensive to strike a print. Alternatively, having them digitized could give you both an external copy of the Kodachromes you have and a viewable file for viewing and sharing if they're home movies. That's important to be able to interact with your film that way. So yeah, reaching out. I mean, we certainly do work for clients and outside institutions, so we could provide a quote or something like that. There are also open source scanners that, if they have the ability to embark on a project like that, might be feasible. Something called the kinograph you could look into. But those would be to answer the question specifically about the negatives. For preservation, it would be advantageous, but not so much for interacting with.
Also, I would just like to say, please store your Kodachromes in a cold and dry environment to preserve their lifespan as long as possible.
And I'll second that you can do that with your photographs as well. Like, take care of your photos. Another question from one of our colleagues is, are you working on formats beyond 35 millimeter or on experimental non-narrative film works?
Yes, I mean, we work with 16 millimeter all the way down to 8 and Super 8 millimeter. And the X-ray film that we just mentioned is, I would say, on the experimental end of things, or abstract. But yeah, plenty of non-narrative films pass through the lab and are in the collection. We hold elements as well that are even less standard, like 28 millimeter or 9.5 millimeter, 17.5 millimeter, things like this. At the lab, unfortunately, we're not currently able to digitize those, but we're looking into ways to expand our offerings in that.
Great. Just a few more questions here. Thanks for everyone submitting your questions. This is great. This says, how many people work in your restoration team, and do you work together on each film or work independently on each different film?
I would say both. So three people. Well, there are maybe 5 or 6 in the film preservation services team, but they're also our preservation manager and our curator of digital exhibitions. So they have other sort of tasks that they're attending to while also being a part of this, our services. So really, it's the 3 of us that you see here that are doing the day-to-day work on most of our preservations, and we'll sort of be a lead on different films, but will lend help, or be a point person on one, and then task, say, Josh with backing something up to tape, or Graham with repairing the splices, and I'll maybe do the scanning, something like that. But we're all able to cover all of the roles. It just depends on what's needed with each project.
All right, next question, which I'm going to be honest, I don't understand the question. So even like a little explanation of what the question is asking. It says, wait, do you work on your DPXs and not on Digi intermediates?
We are working on the DPXs, which, I mean, the term digital intermediate gets ascribed to many different, I guess, digital elements, but we are creating digital intermediates through the DPXs. Like, the DPXs are the frame by frame digital representation. So once we take a raw scan of a film reel, we put that aside. We make sure there's a copy of that remains untouched and uncompressed, and then we'll make a copy of those and do our work on that sequence, if that makes sense. So then once we're creating exports, we could have a number of different sequences that may or may not be technically considered a digital intermediate, but by the technical definition, but are all still DPX files, if that makes sense.
And our grading and restoration programs are what we call non-destructive. So that means when we make changes in these programs, we aren't actually altering the original file that we're importing. So if we have a DPX file and we grade it, that original file still is the same as it was off of the scanner. And then when we export it, we generate a new DPX sequence with those changes baked in. And that's where the multiple copies of the same reel that Josh was mentioning with digital archiving comes in, is we'll have our original scans that get put through these non-destructive editors, and then we generate new copies of them with those changes applied.
The person that asked the question said that this was very helpful. So thank you. And then our last question for today's session says, to what extent, if any, is restoration work still performed photochemically? For example, physically washing the film, recreating opticals, tinting, color timing, etc.
Yeah, one thing we didn't mention is that we also have an ultrasonic film cleaner at the lab. So unfortunately, the solvent that's used in it is going through some fluctuations in production. So we don't know that it has a long lifespan in front of it. But in years prior, we were able to, if possible, say with a negative that's in good shape, we would physically clean the film first in an ultrasonic film cleaner directly before scanning. Additionally, there are techniques like wet gate printing, where a film right in the gate where it's duplicated from one film to the next is submerged in a solution that has the same refractive index as the film base itself. So it helps to mask the scratches that are some of the scratches that are present. That can also be applied in a digital capture scenario. But if the question was specifically about photochemical, those are at least at least two of the techniques. There are techniques to rehydrate the film base or replasticize to restore the plasticizer. If a film is very, very brittle, you can expose it to certain chemicals for specific ranges of time to help get its flexibility back. And there are some labs there's a lab in Europe that still creates physically tinted copies, and apparently the results are amazing, but the process is very, very secret and very heavily guarded. So at the museum we did have a historical processes lab that created some tinting experiments, and were able to create some physically applied color methods. But I don't think we have, I don't know that we would use them for our preservation projects currently.
All right, those are all of the questions that we have for today. Chris, Graham, Josh, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. This was really interesting to listen to. I personally learned so much. If people have additional questions or have more questions that they'd like to ask the film preservation team, you can send anything to info@eastman.org, and we will direct those to the people that can answer your questions. So I just want to let you know that the Q&A does not have to stop here. And thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.